This morning, my daughter Julia was on her second grade classroom Zoom meeting. And I was upstairs and she was downstairs sitting at my desk. And I heard her teacher start to talk about how she wanted her students to be extra nice to their parents, and how kind they've been to her, and how important it was that they understood the stress that their parents were under, and trying to teach them and do their work. And then she started fielding all these questions from these little, 8 and 9-year-olds, wondering, when do we get to go on our field trip? What's the date now? They've been looking forward to this field trip all year. And when do we get to come back? And I just was listening to her just show such grace to our families and such patience and love to these kids. And it made me think of how I am not able to show that grace, or haven't done a good job of showing that kind of grace. I feel frustrated with the Zoom meetings, and I get impatient with everything going on. And it reminded me of something I wanted to share about God this week, is that He is a God of grace. And when I say grace, I mean unmerited favor, or an undeserved gift. God just shows us grace all throughout the scripture. A couple weeks ago I talked about creation, and God shows amazing grace in that story, because after He created everything good, people screwed up and they made a mistake, and they sinned, and they felt shame. And God, they felt shame in their nakedness. They were naked and they felt shame, and God made them clothes. He showed them grace, and He covered their shame. And when you read about David, he was said to be a man after God's own heart, and yet he made some pretty big mistakes. I think of the story of him with Bathsheba, which if you haven't read that one, check it out. But he takes this other man's wife, and he makes it so her husband is killed in battle, and he has a child with her, and yet still God shows David grace and says, this is a man after my own heart. And throughout the Old Testament, the Israelites, He shows them grace. He calls them His chosen people, even though once He rescues them from Egypt, they complain in the desert. They complain that they want water. They complain about the food they have. They complain about how it probably would have just been better if they had been slaves in Egypt. And yet He shows them grace, and He fulfills every promise He's ever given them. They worship other gods. They ask for judges to save them. They ask for a king like everybody else, and ignore that God's their king. And He shows them grace. And ultimately, like we talked about on Easter, Jesus comes. God sends His Son and shows all of us who've made mistakes, which is every one of us, He shows us all grace by sending Jesus to die for us, so that we could be with Him again for eternity if we believe in Him. He showed us total, unmerited favor. So what does that mean? What does that mean in the middle of all of this, in this world where we're struggling and there's trouble, and it can be hard to remember the grace that you and I have? And not only can it be difficult to remember it, but to even understand that God's grace is in fact enough, that alone is enough for us. The Apostle Paul, who wrote a bunch of the letters in our New Testament, he wrote in 2 Corinthians, he wrote in chapter 2 that he had a thorn in his flesh. And we don't know what that thorn was. I mean, it could have been something physical. Some people think maybe it was bad eyesight. or something else, or it could have been just he thought of all the persecution he faced from the Jewish community as a thorn. But we're not sure. But what we do know is that it was something that he prayed God would take away. He prayed that God would remove this from him. And in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 8 through 10, Paul writes this: 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weakness, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weakness, in insult, in hardship, in persecution, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. So to think back about this morning, as I listen to this second grade teacher of my daughter, and I think of my own anger and frustration and moments of anxiousness that I've been having, and some of them over the second grade class that's going on in my basement, I think how I need to hear this message, as Paul did, that his grace is sufficient for me. It's all I really need today. Because his grace shown through Jesus' sacrifice saves me, and it gives me purpose and hope. And his grace is sufficient for you too. Think about it.